welcome back to week 7 of our class. This week we're going to do our presidency lecture, which on our previous syllabus had taken up 2 weeks. We obviously don't need 2 weeks. I'm just going to record the whole lecture for you now. And then we'll just shift everything down, which will be nice. It will give us an extra week at the end of the semester to prep for finals and all that kind of stuff. So I just uploaded our new syllabus. It looks like this. So we're doing presidency this week. You also do not have an assignment or anything due this week because your essay was just due on Friday. Next week you have exam 2 and then the movie stuff. And again, all of this is already uploaded. And so you'll see down here, we actually have 2 full weeks where we won't have an uploaded lecture, but we will still have assignments due. So I will obviously be sending reminders for that on our Discord channel and on the announcements page of Brightspace, but we will have finished our lectures by the 3rd week of November. That means we have extra time here to prep. It also means we'll have have extra time available if you guys want to do a video call, or we can schedule more office hours, whatever it has to be, to prep for this. So we will have 2 weeks of no lectures and then the final exam. If you have questions, thoughts, concerns about that, please let me know. In prep for your second exam next Friday, I've made this, it's basically Kahoot, but it's a different website. And I need you to join the class. Admittedly, I was a little confused. So if you'll look, there's like a place to have a team, but there's also a place to have a class, and they're different things. I didn't fully understand that. That was my fault. I'm going to upload 2 links during this lecture, so they'll both be on Brightspace. One of them will be this link. As you can see, it's only valid for 10 days. So please, as soon as you're seeing this lecture, join this link, so you can have access to prepping. Basically, what the prep is I will assign you, I don't know if I can pull it up because I don't want you to see the answers, but I will assign you this exam 2 study guide that I have. And in addition to the study guide, which is already on Brightspace, which you should already be using to prep for our exam, here it is. This has 60 questions. This is obviously more questions than will be on your exam. Your exam will have 50 questions. It will look just like the first exam. This means, right, that there's more content on this study guide than you will technically need on the exam. That's because I think it's important for you to know. This also means that not every question on the exam will be in this little study guide. So that's why you should still be using the actual study guide. There might be a question on the exam that is not in here. Please do not rely on this solely as your only form of tracking. Can you hear me? I'm assuming that you could have heard me the whole time. I'm gonna hope to God that that was the case. So, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna start making a little post. I'm gonna copy this link. We're gonna go to communicate announcements. All right. So in this announcement, which I will just post, lecture number 7, link. There's that. There's also going to be link video from PowerPoint. In our PowerPoint, we have a link. I'm just going to post this here. Hopefully you watched, oh no, not ads, not political ads. Hopefully you watched the last video from our last PowerPoint. This video is kind of making fun of that one and applying it to Congress. So I'm going to post these right now. Actually, I'm going to save it and post these right as I finish the lecture. So that's that. Cool. We're going to get into this. This has the most slides out of all of our PowerPoints. So this will be the most dense, but we'll get started. This is the beginning of our next exam. I should also mention that. So if you look at our study guide down here, not our study guide, I'm so sorry, our syllabus. If you look at our syllabus and then you count, right, these 3 PowerPoints were on our first exam. Media, Federalism, and Congress will be your second exam. So Presidency starts your third exam. Your third exam will have Presidency, Judicial, and then Bureaucracy. So this is starting your third exam. We're going to talk about the Presidency. We're going to talk about the powers and responsibilities of the president, the disparity in expectations and reality from the public of the president, the evolution of the presidency, how the executive branch is organized and functioned. The executive branch is more than just the president, so we'll talk about what that means in practicality, and then the relationship of the president to citizens and to the other branches. Here's a little video. I hope you watch it. It's funny. Here's photos of all of our presidents. Obviously George Washington, down to Trump and then Biden. The photos are kind of janky. Sorry. It's hard to do that. So what is the presidency, or the executive branch? It is created by Article 2 of the Constitution. So Article 1, if you remember, is our legislative branch, which is Congress. Article 2 is the executive branch, which is the president and all of the offices that come with it. They have 4-year terms, and they have to serve, or they can only serve 2 terms. This did not used to be the case. If you know, Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, is infamous for having served 4 terms as president, so he served for a total of 16 years. That was not typical. Before him, presidents had only served 2 terms and then graciously gave up the office. This was a trend that George Washington started in response to the Revolution, in response to the fear of a monarchy and tyranny. George Washington gave up his post after 8 years total as president, and that was the custom until FDR. FDR came in and was basically fixing things after the Great Depression, so he continued running for office and continued to get elected. He was very, very popular. And after he decided, like, yeah, basically, we're out, we're donezo, a law was created, so you can only serve a total of 8 years. These years do not have to be in order, right? So, like, theoretically, President Trump could get elected again, and then he would serve 4 years, and then he would be termed out. He could not run again. But you do not have to serve them back to back, although that is often how it has happened. The only other president to not do that was Grover Cleveland back in the 1800s. So George Washington was inaugurated at Federal Hall in New York City, also where our first Congress met. So if you remember correctly, our first official capital was in New York City. And the requirements to be president: you have to be 35 years old. You have to be a natural-born citizen, which means you were born in the country. And then you have to be a U.S. resident for at least 4 years. So if by chance you move away to go to college or you work a job in another country, you cannot just immediately come back and run for president. You have to have lived in the country for 14 years before becoming president, consecutively. The roles of the president basically fall into 2 camps. They are either formal roles or they are informal. What makes a role formal is that it is granted directly by the Constitution. So this is stuff that is listed in Article 2. They are the head of government. They can make appointments to the Supreme Court or to cabinets. They can also veto. However, they do also have informal roles, which are things that are not written into law, but they are implied powers. They are powers the president has adopted over time, and they're very, very important. So this would be stuff like being the head of state or representing our nation abroad. Things that aren't necessarily lined out for them as a responsibility, but they do have. Their formal roles are obviously much more direct, less vague, because it is lined out by Article 2. So the Constitution gives the president the responsibility to take care that laws be faithfully executed, and they supervise the rest of the executive branch. This is all of the cabinets. These are the ambassadors. These are the press secretary. All of these positions, basically, that are in the White House or representing the White House, would be the executive branch. They have three main roles in this. It is the chief administrator, the commander-in-chief, I'm sure you've heard of that, and then the chief of foreign policy. So they're pretty self-explanatory. The chief administrator, under that role, the president is leading administrative duties. So again, heads of cabinet, heads of executive offices. Obviously, I'm sure you've heard of the role of commander-in-chief. This is pretty self-explanatory. The president oversees the military. And then the last one is chief of foreign policy, which just means that they are our primary diplomat and they formulate treaties. Please note, right, that they cannot ratify treaties. That must be done by Congress. So the president can enter into a treaty, but that does not mean that that treaty is active until Congress approves it or ratifies it. That's what that means. But the president is the one who will negotiate a treaty, meet with the other countries, and outline what that treaty would look like. Obviously, the president cannot be everywhere all at the same time, and there are a million things that need to be done every single day. So we have many, many, many offices of the executive branch. The cabinet is probably the one that you've heard the most about, and it is the one that has a lot of representative authority. So the cabinet is the group of people directly surrounding the president who are making these decisions. These are not like the president's chief of staff or the president's press secretary. Those are closer to the president, but they are representing the president, whereas the cabinet is a group of departments that work on other things. So the president would get elected, and then they would appoint their secretaries. The president would appoint them, and again, checks and balances, Congress has to confirm them, which means every single appointment that the president makes will go into Congress, and Congress will ask them questions, and they'll do an investigation, and then they'll have to vote. Congress votes on every single one of these people, whether or not they can get to serve in that capacity as secretary of whatever it is. Here are just a couple of the really, really important ones. Agriculture, housing and urban development, transportation is a big one. The current Secretary of Transportation is Pete Buttigieg. He's been everywhere in the news lately. I'm sure you've seen him. He is our current Secretary of Transportation. The Secretary of Energy is also pretty big. Homeland Security, of course. The State Department, or the Secretary of State, is also a pretty big position. And then the Secretary of Defense, also very, very important. The president will always have a chief of staff, but very often their Secretary of Defense will serve as another right-hand man. So here are a couple of photos of presidents with their Secretary of Defenses. This is very, very common. You see them together all the time, especially in times of conflict, right? So we're thinking of times of war, or times of crises, or times of engagements with other countries. The Cuban Missile Crisis was obviously a really big one. So here is President Kennedy with his Secretary of State, or Secretary of Defense, McNamara. If anyone watches the Post movie, which again you cannot do without letting me know because we voted on Spotlight, but if you're uncomfortable with Spotlight and you choose to watch the Post, you will hear about McNamara a lot. He is a key figure in that movie. Not because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because of the Pentagon Papers, but same guy. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is just an example of how important the Secretary of Defense can be. We were in conflict. Obviously, it was the Cold War, so we weren't in direct deployment conflict. But it was the Cold War, and we were in a state of conflict. We were nervous of Russia, or at that time the Soviet Union, and nuclear missiles, mutually assured destruction, that kind of thing. Basically, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the state of, for a simple explanation, Russia was getting very, very close to the U.S. They were setting up around Cuba. Cuba at the time was going through an internal conflict, and they were setting up nuclear missiles very, very close to the United States off of Cuba. So rather than immediately respond, which was to be expected, like the expected response, JFK and his Secretary of Defense decided to essentially blockade Cuba, and it intimidated the Soviet Union, I suppose, at the time, and the conflict was dissolved, and it did not ultimately turn into a nuclear war, which saved a lot of people and the future of our country. So the Secretary of Defense, very, very important. They play a very large role in the executive branch. They play a massive role in conflict, times of conflict and war, and like whether or not we press the big red button, for lack of a better term. They also have a vice president, obviously, right? So we have a president and then we have a vice president. And the vice president also has their own executive offices that they get to appoint, choose. And the vice president is really only as influential as the president wants them to be. So in situations like Reagan and Bush, or Bush and Quayle, the VPs were not very influential. They did not have a very big role. A lot of people don't know who the VPs of this time were. And at that time, when they're not very influential, they're mainly selected as a way to garner votes of a specific population. However, there are other times, that's a typo, I should say Bush, where presidents and their VPs are very, very influential. So Biden, under the Obama administration, had a very big role. Dick Cheney, under the Bush administration, also had a very big role. And then Gore, under the Clinton administration, was very influential. All of these vice presidents were often seen very in the public eye a lot. They were very active on executive orders and legislation in the Senate, and voting on bills in the Senate. Remember, the vice president is basically the only person who gets to serve in two different branches of the government. So the vice president is serving in the executive branch under the president, and as their role, They are also serving in the legislative branch as leader of the Senate. So they get to hold both hats and be more influential in one or the other, depending on what their role is. And then Pence and Trump, right? Like, we haven't really reflected completely on this yet. How influential was Pence under Trump's administration? Arguably, he was not too influential during the administration, but he will very likely go down as influential at the end when he ultimately decided to certify the 2020 election results. And then we're seeing the Biden-Harris administration now, and whether Harris is influential or not to Biden's administration. I think a lot of people would say that she is because they see her a lot. That does not mean that she's influential in the office, right? We see her out a lot because she is campaigning. She is running to be president. That does not mean that she is taking a ton of action as her role of vice president. She has gotten to do a lot of things as leader of the Senate. She's broken quite a bit of Senate ties, but her role as vice president is still to be determined. Some people would say that she hasn't been influential. Some people would say that she has. And then moving on to their informal roles, the president's informal roles. Again, they're representing the nation, they're meeting with foreign dignitaries, and the last part of this that often gets skipped over is being leader of their party, right? So in addition to serving as president, in addition to representing the United States to all of our other countries and allies and enemies, the president is also the leader of their party, right? If you ask generally the general public who the leader of the Democratic Party is, most people will say Biden, maybe Harris. If you ask a lot of Republicans who the leader of the Republican Party is, a lot of people are going to say Trump because he was the last president of the Republican Party. So they are also the leader of their party, and that holds a lot of weight within building legislation and whether or not executive orders get questioned or whether vetoes get overridden by Congress, that kind of thing. The president is also supposed to interpret the general will of the people because they have a national constituency. If you remember what constituency means, it is just the person represented. The president is the only person in the country who has a national constituency. I mean, I guess the vice president too, but to a lesser degree. People are primarily electing the president. Sure, right? You vote on the president and the vice president, but you're really choosing the president. So because everyone gets to vote, and because everyone is represented by this same person, the president is the leader of the country. Therefore, he needs to interpret the general will of the whole country. You can see how that would be very, very difficult. You can see how that would cause a lot of unhappiness. And most people, generally speaking, presidents do not have above a 50% approval rating. It's just very hard to interpret the general will of 333 billion people. Did I say billion? It's definitely... I'm so tired. Okay. They're also the keeper of domestic peace, aka they're addressing crises and emergencies. And you think of things like Katrina or the Challenger explosion, COVID-19, the bombing of the federal building, and most recently, Hurricane, are we saying Helen or Helene? I don't know. I haven't heard it spoken. But obviously the hurricane that just destroyed most of North Carolina, a lot of Appalachia. It has taken roads out that won't be built back up until well into 2025 or 2026. Hundreds, thousands of people have lost homes and belongings and lives. And it's obviously a very, very sad thing. And the president is supposed to act as a keeper of peace in this time, addressing these crises and choosing how to respond. The thing that this often becomes a controversy about is that the president, serving in the role of the federal government, often cannot just step right into something like this, especially when it's a state issue. So, because, right, we have federalism, and because our governments, our local, state, and federal governments, all have different powers, a separation of powers, they can't just like overstep each other, right? So obviously, the state government can't make federal laws. That is very obvious. What isn't so obvious is that the federal government cannot just step into states' problems. We saw this also happen when there was the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, over on the East Coast or the eastern border of Ohio. There was a train derailment and it impacted a lot of people. And obviously the president couldn't just step right in because there is a level of government, the state government, that has to invite that bureaucracy. If they're not inviting the bureaucracy in, and the bureaucracy or the federal government is stepping in anyway, they're overstepping their powers, and it will ultimately lead to a conflict if that help isn't welcome. But even if the president can't take direct action in these kinds of things, it's still important to address them. It's still important to recognize that it happened, kind of give condolences, and be a face available. So obviously here's a photo of Trump with a mask on during COVID. The Challenger, right? Like nothing really could be done much about that. Unfortunately, it exploded and things were done over with. But just the getting on TV and the recognizing that this happened and outlining what steps would be taken to make sure it didn't happen again, or how we were going to restructure NASA, or apologizing, right? That kind of thing is very, very important, even if it doesn't have to be a direct action. Along with that, right, we have the power of suggestion, which is really based on these current events, these tragedies, and the approval rating of the president. So the president's power beyond executive orders is really based on their approval rating, how much power they have. If the president is very popular, they're more than likely going to be able to get better legislation or more legislation passed, both through executive orders, but also they can influence legislation in Congress. And current events often affect those approval ratings. So stuff like COVID, Katrina, even down to inflation or natural disasters, all of these things impact approval ratings. Approval ratings are also taken just about every day, and they change just about every day. So you can always just look up current presidential approval ratings. This is a recent one from 3 days ago, and you can see how it changes. They usually take it every couple of days. So right now, Biden's approval rating is pretty low. It's at about 41%. His switch where he lost was late August of 2021. So up until then, he had over 50% approval, and then it went down, and he has been rocking a majority disapproval rating since then. Where is this? His approval rating was lowest in early July, which I would be willing to bet is right around when he officially dropped out of the presidential race. And then his approval rating went back up just a little, and since then it's been pretty steady. It's gone down a couple of times. This is pretty typical. Let's look at President Trump's approval ratings. I want to look at the graph. Okay, so this is current. Obviously, he's not president right now. But similarly speaking, right, he has a majority disapproval rating. Most people think unfavorably of him, starting in February 2021 all the way through. And of course, it fluctuates a little bit, goes up and down a little bit. I wonder if they're doing Harris approval ratings. Okay, so even still, right, we see it here again. She had majority approval for quite some time, and then right around when Biden's crossed over, hers did too. She's had majority disapproval ratings. Things are getting a little bit closer together right now, but even when she officially took the nomination, it was still pretty high disapproval ratings. This is not uncommon. This is very, very common. Presidents of both parties generally have pretty low approval ratings, and that is the average. So right around somewhere in 40% is about the average approval rating of a standing president at any given time. So Obama's average was a 48, Bush's was a 49, Clinton was a 55. Where's the average? Yeah, approval average. So 41, 48, 49, 55, 61. Bush's was highest, right around 9/11, I believe. Am I rating that correctly? Reagan's was in the low 50s. Everyone's right about the 40s. Kennedy was a anomaly. He had a very, very high approval rating. Of course, his term was short-lived, unfortunately. FDR had an average of a 63, which, considering that he served for about 16 years, is actually really, really good. But this is not, like, Biden's, Trump's, Harris's approval ratings are not crazy absurd. These are very typical. Most presidents will be pressed to get over 50% approval ratings. So even with around a 40 to 45%, this is still a relative amount of power if they want to impact legislation. So what does succession look like if a president dies in office or is impeached for the following offenses that they can be impeached for? There is a Succession Act established in 1974 that lays it out. Basically, it would go vice president. If for some reason they're also unable to serve, then it would move to the Speaker of the House. Then it would go to the pro tempore of the Senate. And from there, we start getting into the cabinet secretaries. I don't know who's first. It might be this. I believe it's either the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense. There's a really good show about the succession of the president on Netflix. I think it's on. I'll probably add that to the announcement as well. If you're interested, it's a pretty good show. The president has some legislative powers. It's basically the State of the Union and then a veto. The State of the Union is just that speech that the president gives every year. Usually they give it in January. It is required of them by the Constitution. And the goal of it is to set their policy agenda for the year. What they plan to do, what they plan to get done, and their goals for that year. It is televised, publicized. A lot of people in our country watch. A lot of people outside of the country, around the world, also watch. Again, they have a veto. They have 3 options, technically 4, when a bill from Congress is presented to them. They can sign it, and it goes into law. They can veto it, and then Congress could overrule that veto if they have enough votes. They could ignore it, and eventually it will die at the end of session, and Congress would have to reintroduce it. Or they could do something called a pocket veto, which is a little complicated, and I'm not going to ask you about it. But feel free to Google it if you would like. Basically, not the Minecraft. It's called keeping it in their pocket because they don't take any action, and then it basically kills it. It's similar to ignoring the bill, but they could at any time sign it into law if they want. They could just pull it out of their pocket and then sign it. They can create executive orders, which is what that fun video at the beginning of the lecture is about. And they also have signing statements, which will be on your exam 3, so you should know this. It is when they're adding notes, basically to the end of a bill that they've signed. Here's just a little graph of all the vetoes. I think it's interesting to look at. FDR obviously has the most. He was in office for the longest. Biden has had 12 vetoes. None of them have been overridden. Overriding vetoes is pretty uncommon. The last time it happened substantially was during Reagan's term. Executive orders are not in the Constitution, but they do have the power of law. They do not need to be approved by Congress. Again, this is in the video. The video is, I think, a really good video about it. The thing about executive orders is that they are subject to judicial review, which means the Supreme Court can come in at any time and say, no, this is not constitutional, therefore it is not into effect. This is what we keep seeing happen with Biden trying to forgive student loans. He will sign an executive order forgiving student loans under some pretenses, and then ultimately it goes to the Supreme Court. We'll talk about it another time, but the Supreme Court has a conservative majority, which is not the same ideology as Biden. So it's pretty expected that they will rule his executive order unconstitutional, therefore it is null and void. And what presidents will do is they'll just keep rewriting it with different little changes to see if eventually the Supreme Court will allow it to stand. The legal basis for executive orders in Article 2 is this clause that just says the president has broad executive authority to use at their discretion. And that's where the idea of an executive order came from. But the term executive order is not actually in the Constitution. And then the last thing is a signing statement. So this is just the notes that a president adds to a bill. It's usually just their interpretation, how they plan to execute the law, and then how they think it will be carried out. And they'll add it when they sign it. And a lot of it is for posterity's sake, but it's also for tracking's sake. So other people can look back at previous legislation and read how the president wanted to use it and if they did or not. They obviously have some judicial powers. Basically, they're appointing our judges, right? We knew that. They also appoint the Solicitor General of the Justice Department, who is in charge of arguing the cases in front of the Supreme Court. So when Biden signs an executive order trying to forgive all student loans, and the Supreme Court says, we're going to hear that case, we don't think you can do that, the Solicitor General is the one who will go to the Supreme Court and argue that, yes, this is a legal power, this is constitutional, the president can do this. And the Supreme Court will hear that argument, and whether or not they decide to take it is obviously up to them. The president can also issue pardons for people who have been convicted of a crime. And there's two different ways they can do this. So they can do this through individual pardoning, or they can do this through general amnesty, which is for a large group. So an individual pardon restores all rights and privileges of a convict. And presidents use this pretty often. And whether or not they use it will affect their approval ratings. It will affect their party, like how they're looked at, right? So Ford pardoned Nixon of Watergate, and that got him some backlash. Obama did not choose to pardon Edward Snowden, so that also caused some controversy. Some people were supportive, some people were not supportive, because they thought that either Snowden was betraying the United States and our national security, or they thought that Snowden was being patriotic and telling people what the government is watching, basically. Presidents will often, in the last couple weeks of their term, go through and just pardon a ton of people. This is very common. Every president does it. General amnesty is different. So a pardon is very individual. You are pardoning one person for what they are convicted of. General amnesty is given to a large group of people. So Carter, President Jimmy Carter, he gave general amnesty to a very, very large group of people who had dodged the draft. Again, controversial. Some people thought that was a great decision. Some people thought, no, it was bad. They were being unpatriotic by not participating in the draft and fighting for their country. Obviously, right, the power a president has shifts, although similar to the federal government as a whole, it is steadily increasing. Lincoln increased it with the Civil War. Teddy Roosevelt then increased it with the bully pulpit. FDR, in his four terms, increased it with the New Deal economics and all of the public funding and public works that he created. Nixon and the Watergate scandal obviously cast a lot of doubt and distrust in the executive branch and the president. So Congress actually got more power during that era, or more trust. Clinton, same thing. He had the scandal, which I want to be clear, he did not get in trouble for whether or not he had sexual relations with that woman. He got in trouble for lying about it because he was under oath when he lied. Should he have done it? No. It reflects very badly on him as a person and as a president, and there is a general distrust of him that he did it in the first place. But all of the legal trouble that he got in was not because he did it. It was because he lied about doing it under oath. But anyway, he had this big scandal. Obviously, a lot of people distrusted him and the executive branch, so power shifted back to Congress. And then President Bush and Dick Cheney issued a ton of signing statements on all of their legislation, which kind of garnered a lot of that power back to the presidency. Obviously, presidents have to play party politics because they are the leader of their party. I'm going to go through this really quickly. There's two types of government. There's unified government. This is when Congress and president are of the same party. It's a lot easier to get things done when this is the case. There's also divided government, which is when Congress is ruled by one party, the presidency is ruled by another party, and at this time, it is often very, very difficult to get legislation passed. Congress may pass it, but the president will veto it. Whereas in unified government, because they are of the same party, they have the same goals, they have the same ideas and party platform and ideology, they will use that to get more things passed. This is just a little graph. You can't read it very well, but I just wanted you to see what this looks like. Divided government is all of the green. Unified government is the red. It is much more likely to have a divided government than it is to have a unified government. In fact, we haven't had a big chunk of unified government since the late 60s. This is just another one. This separates House and Senate. So, generally speaking, this is just Congress. This is separate. The House, the Senate, and the White House. This happens even more infrequently. Most often, the actual Congress will be split. So the House will probably be, for example, the House will be Republican, and the Senate will be a Democrat majority. There is an expectation gap versus what the president actually can get done and what the voters want the president to do. And we see this happen very often. A big part of this, again, was the student loan forgiveness. People really expected Biden to get this done, and he hasn't. He's been able to get it done in some small pieces, but not as a massive act. The big thing with Trump was his border wall, which obviously, that was one of the big selling points of his 2016 election. And he ended up only getting a very, very small portion of this wall built, and Mexico did not pay for any of it. So he got some backlash for that. And a lot of this is due both in part to whether the president is working with a unified or divided Congress, but also in what the president actually has the power to do. And we're seeing this happen a lot right now, where the president really can't just forgive all of these student loans. The president really can't just make another country pay us thousands of dollars to build a border wall. These aren't actual powers that the president has. And on one hand, should they be making this a massive piece of their party platform? No. But on the other hand, there is a disconnect between what people think a president can do, and in order to get elected, the president or people running for president will often use that disconnect, and they'll say things that they know will be popular to get them elected, hoping that they will have a Congress of the same party and they can make more progress towards getting that done. But very, very rarely can a president actually do this, especially on their own. It's just not within their legal rights. That's why the student loan forgiveness keeps getting pushed out by the Supreme Court. Again, they're under a media microscope constantly, and every action they take is subject to scrutiny from media and the public, especially because we're running on this 24-hour news cycle where we're constantly finding things to get people to hear about. And this will also impact their approval ratings. This is just a photo of Obama. I think he was rushing somewhere. I'm sure he had somewhere to be. The president always has somewhere to be. Um, and he ended up running onto the helicopter, or Air Force One, or whatever it was, without saluting. That was a faux pas. Presidents always salute the guards standing, and he ended up running back down the little stairs and shaking the guy's hand. And that actually ended up having more of a reaction because that's not proper. You're supposed to salute. Shaking their hand is not the proper way to interact with them. So he got a lot of scrutiny for that, and it impacted his approval rating for probably a week or so. And then the very last piece of this that I want to touch on is the First Lady, because the First Lady actually does have a lot of power as well. When Wilson had a stroke, his wife stepped in and took care of a lot of things for him. Eleanor Roosevelt was actually a delegate to the UN. She also had a massive hand in the civil rights movement of that time, not like the one that you're thinking of the 60s and 70s. Nancy Reagan was really, really big with the Just Say No platform. That was actually her big movement. Hillary Clinton, during Bill Clinton's presidency, did a lot for healthcare reform. Michelle Obama also had a ton of influence. Everyone always talks about the thanks Obama thing or thanks Michelle, because she got rid of vending machines in schools. She was running on this. She had this platform of trying to be more nutritious, more healthy. She was also ranked most admired women, one of the most admired women, for 3 years during Obama's presidency. And then Jill Biden, she gets a lot of influence and support because she is a teacher, and very rarely most often there is this idea in society that teachers are not appreciated. They have very low pay, they work a lot of long hours. A lot of people don't respect their teachers or like their teachers, especially in school. So Jill Biden, being a teacher, got her a lot of support, especially during the 2020 election. That is all I have. I know this was a little bit of a long one. I promise moving forward, they'll start to get shorter and shorter. This lecture does usually take 2 full weeks. So hopefully we'll just get it all done this week, and then we can get ahead and have tons of time without new content to prepare for the final. So again, I will get your essays like I posted in the Discord, and it is in the syllabus. I need at least a week to finish all of the grading, depending on the assignment, aka essays. This could take longer. I release all the grades at the same time. So I grade them, and then they're hidden from you, and then I release them all at one time. This is so someone doesn't get their grade today and someone has to wait until Friday. That's just not fair. So I grade them as I go and then release them all at one time. Please give me at least a week. I try to get them done before then. Sometimes I can't. I think that should be doable this time around. So if you're seeing a big 0 in Brightspace, that's why. It's not a big deal. You're going to have a grade, I promise. I just need more than a day. It's the weekend for me too. Other than that, please use the link I will post on Brightspace to join the quizzes account so you can start prepping for exam 2. And the study guide. Please look at the study guide as well. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to email me or message on Discord. And thank you so much. Bye.